Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and with us, as he is almost every week, is the Auxiliary Bishop of Los Angeles, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, great to have you.
Brandon, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful, especially because this episode follows one of the most exciting moments in the history of Chicago culture. You're a Chicago guy. I know you must have been excited.
Oh my!
Tell us what happened and what it meant to you.
Well, I happened to be in Chicago when the Cubs won the pennant. I was home for a family wedding and for some other things, and I was coming back from the reception. I remember I was following the game. That's when they won the pennant, and I knew they were ahead, but I hadn't, heard about the end of the game. But coming back to the hotel on the highway, I began to see fireworks going off over Chicago, and I knew the Cubs had won the pennant. So that was great. I mean,
and the pennant is what for non-baseball fans?
Yeah,
here?
when they win the National League, right? So the World Series.
So that's kind of like the semifinals before the World Series,
right? But I think given baseball especially, there's something about winning the pennant that has a lot of cachet. Well, anyway, so that was great, and I'm a typical Cub fan where all right, Lord, you gave us that. It's probably asking too much if they win the World Series, so thank you for this gift, So anyway, then I come back to L.A., and the series is going on. And, of course, the Cubs get down 3-1. And every Cub fan, believe me, in the world was like, all right, here we go. And they lost 2 games at Wrigley Field, Anyway, so we were all pretty depressed. Then they win a game at Wrigley. Okay, 3-2. But now we're going back to Cleveland. We got to win 2 games in Cleveland. Then they win Game 6. And we're like, okay, but this is a setup for the perfect Cub, So the last game, I was actually here at my house, and I had a guest for dinner. And I thought, okay, good. I don't want to watch the beginning of the game. It's too much. I can't handle the pressure of it, So dinner went on till about 8 o'clock, which is 10 o'clock or about 11 o'clock out there on the East Coast. And I was kind of following the game a little bit. I knew the Cubs were ahead. I finally get back to my room. It's now the 8th inning. They're leading 6-3, right? I think we're pretty good. And then in classic fashion, that awful 8th inning, they give up 3 runs. The game is tied. At which point I turned it off. I couldn't take it. I just couldn't take it. And then I check in the phone every once in a while. I finally, they'd won the game. And then I turned it back on and watched all the celebrations. It was one of the great moments for me. I mean, I've been a Cub fan since I was 9 years old when our family moved back to Chicago. And I've been rooting for the Cubs ever since. And went through all of the kind of Augustinian angst of being a Cubs fan, which is you look at life in a kind of grim way. And I mean that only half kind of tongue in cheek. You get a kind of a grim view of life. And so when they won, it was like the sun came out or something. The world began turning the other direction. My experience, I'll again put it theologically, it was a nunc dimittis moment. That's the Lord, now you let your servant go in peace moment. Because I really mean this. If the Cubs now, the rest of my life, come in 5th place every year, in a way I don't really care because they won the World Series. There's nothing better, nothing greater in sports in my mind could happen. Because the Cubs are the team of my heart, So it's been weird, tell you the truth. And I know I'm maybe musing about it too seriously and too theologically, but it's been a weird week.
I know it was especially meaningful for your mother. Talk about that.
Oh, my gosh. My mother, I won't give her age because she'd get mad at me, but let's just put it this way. She's been rooting for the Cubs for a long time. And she's the most loyal fan I know. My mother, it's, let's say, late August 1977. The Cubs are 19 and a half games out of first. They're playing the Houston Astros. They're losing by 7 runs in the 8th inning. And we're like, Mom, why are you watching them? And there she was, still rooting for them. So all these literally decades and decades. And so my mother was the first person I thought of when the Cubs won. The first person in my mind was my mother. That I'm just grateful to God that she got a World Series victory, before the end, so God bless her.
I don't want to dwell on it too much longer, but one thing I noticed as an outsider, as a non-Chicagoan, non-really baseball fan, watching all the reactions online, videos of people crying, filling the streets, there was like a quasi-religious devotion and reaction to it. Talk about that.
And even I go beyond quasi. Well, one that struck me, people writing names of the deceased on the wall at Wrigley Field. I totally get that. You know, like if my mother had died, I'd be tempted to do that, is to go to Wrigley Field and write her name on the wall. And all I could think of was the Jerusalem temple, is people are going up to the temple and leaving votive offerings. And so, yeah, there is something, I'd go even beyond quasi-religious about the devotion of the Cubs. So, yeah, it was amazing to watch. Amazing to watch.
Now, we've titled this episode Bishop Barron at the Movies. Now, you go see movies a lot. In fact, that's one of our most popular forms of content at Word on Fire, is your spiritual, theological commentaries on movies. I know when you first moved out to LA, things were crazy. It was tough to get out to see a lot of movies, but things have opened up a little bit lately, and you've been out to see two just released, really popular films. So I want to spend some time talking about each one of them. The first is Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange. First, give us a brief summary. I should probably add here, there'll probably be some spoilers in this episode. So if you haven't seen the movie and you want to avoid that, maybe download the episode and listen to it later. But we won't try to give too much away. So first, give us a summary of the plot. What was Doctor Strange all about?
Yeah, and of course, I'm not really a Marvel Comics guy. I went with Father Steve, who's the CEO at Word on Fire. When he was a kid, he loved the Marvel Comics, so he really knows the universe. But the story's about this guy, literally named Doctor Strange. He's a neurosurgeon who's hyper skilled, hyper accomplished, only the toughest cases, and he's the cool guy, you know. And he's also a bit of a jerk, self-absorbed, arrogant, dismissive of his colleagues, and all this. Has this terrible car accident. His hands, you know, upon which his artistry depends, are irreparably damaged. Science can't help him. The best surgeons in the world can't help him. And so he falls into a kind of a despair, and he begins looking for a way forward. He hears about this mysterious place in Kathmandu, of course, where impossible cases seem to be addressed and people find healing. So he's thinking of some advanced, science center, and he shows up, and turns out he meets this bald-pated wisdom figure played by Tilda Swinton, the always watchable actress, you know. And he's just put off when she starts talking about, you know, energies and the mind over matter, and it's just by changing your attitude. And he gets so impatient, and he pokes her in the chest and goes, you know, that's all there is matter. That's all that exists. And we're just, you know, blips in an indifferent universe. And he's going on and on. And with that, she kind of pushes at him, and his astral body comes out of his ordinary body, you know. Well, this is his introduction to this world beyond what the sciences can know and control. And then the plot will unfold from there. I won't go into much more detail about it, but it's to me, that was the most fascinating thing about the movie, that it shows a scientist at a very, very high level, and full, if you want, of the arrogance of scientism, you know, the view that the sciences exhaust reality, and he's being initiated into a higher world. And that, I think, is something important for people today to see.
Now, you've noted after you saw the movie that it's interesting how a lot of these movies that open up a transcendent dimension to reality, so things like Doctor Strange or Star Wars, Avatar, you know, these sorts of movies, they often tend to be more Gnostic based. You say they introduce Gnostic land. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it's really, and let me just stay for a second, though, with the positive before we get to that, because there are a lot of things that participate in the religious tradition. So what Doctor Strange has to go through is a purification. He has to let go of his grasping, overweening ego, and he has to enter with a stance of humility so as to understand this higher world. After his extraordinary experience where he senses, boy, there's something real here, they kick him out. And they lock the door. You can't come in. And he stands. I forget now if it's for an entire day or a couple of days, but he's forced to stay outside. Well, that's an old theme from the monastic tradition. If you want to test someone's resolve about the monastic life, are they really willing to leave behind their previous life? Well, you test them. You say, no, there's no room for you. No, we're not taking any novices. No, we can't take you. Lock you out. Well, if someone just walks away, okay, sorry, didn't work out, then he wasn't all that motivated. But if you stay and you stay and you stay, that's a sign of your devotion. So Dr. Strange does that. He hangs in there. And then he goes through an apprenticeship, a sort of initiation into this higher world. I like that. And something I loved in the movie when he talks about, how difficult this is and what will it take and how will I get there? And the wisdom figure says, well, it'll take, a lot of time and a lot of discipline and a lot of study. And then she said, not unlike what it took to become a great neurosurgeon. So, yeah, that required a long apprenticeship and lots of hours and months and years of study. Well, so will this higher world. And I think that in the spiritual order, I want to get in touch with God. Well, okay, great. But are you willing to hang in there and do the apprenticeship and do the hard work? And, so I like that. I think it's a good way to kind of tease people out of this self-regarding scientism that because of the new atheists and others, I think has really gripped young people. There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophies or your sciences. And I like how this movie kind of teases people in that direction.
He also, to that end, also seemed to open up in a relationship with this nurse who he had been previously involved with, but it was very clear, sort of just saw as just an object, just as one more person in his life among many. But then the love dimension emerges, and that, again, is another affirmation that there's more to this reality than just the empirical, the material.
Right. I mean, he was hyper successful, but he was just self-absorbed, and it was all about, use the great Thomistic, quartet. His was probably about wealth and honor. I think honor was very important to him. He's the cool Dr. Strange, and he's got it all together. He's the best neuroscientist in the world. But when you do that, as you suggest correctly, relationships fall apart because they just become means to that end. Do you contribute to my fame or not? If you do, okay, I'll put up with you. If you don't, bye-bye. And watch that now in people's lives. Is what really matters, the awakening of love, that'll fall away. And so only when he realizes his more transcendent mission does he recover authentic love. And that's the way it works.
So again, there's lots of really good things to love about Doctor Strange. To use your language, Bishop, it really punches holes in the buffered self, the Charles Taylor image. But let's look at one of the things I know it kind of irked you was this repeated motif in a lot of these films that punch holes in the buffered self that seem to suggest the way to do that is by gaining special knowledge or Gnosticism. Talk about that.
Yeah, and that's the link, as you mentioned earlier, to this classic heresy called Gnosticism. Gnosis just means knowledge in Greek, and so the Gnostic thing, which is a multi-headed, hydra, but has to do with this view that the higher world is accessed through a specialized knowledge. And the higher world is one that we really want to escape to get away from this world of matter, which has been created by a fallen God, this world of matter which is deeply compromised. And through a special gnosis or knowledge, we escape from it to the higher realm. But then another step, the higher realm is characterized by a sort of endless struggle and endless battle between warring forces. And now you find this, as you said earlier, Star Wars and episode after episode of these movies, you find essentially a Gnostic vision of the spiritual life. A great stress put on the unending, never-ending struggle between good and evil, and the role that gnosis or special knowledge plays in the manipulation of spiritual forces. So think of, again, Star Wars classically as the dark side and light side of the Force always battling. What do you learn through your Jedi training but to manipulate the Force in such a way that you can accomplish, the good that you want to accomplish? A step above mere materialism, yes, and that's true in Star Wars as well. Think of the way Yoda deals with Luke Skywalker, and the discovery of mission. So Luke has got to, yes, my mission is to confront my father and all those things. Nevertheless, you're left with a really unsatisfying spiritual space, which is the Gnostic space. How early, and it's through people like Irenaeus and others, the church said no to this. The church saw this and said no to it. Because the spiritual life is not accessing this sort of endless war between dark and light powers, nor is it finally a matter of learning how to manipulate. Rather, the spiritual life is accepting the invitation of friendship from the one God, who is Lord of all, right? He's not battling some desperate opponent, but God is the Lord of all creation, who's inviting us into friendship. And when we accept that friendship in grace, God is able to work through our freedom to accomplish his purposes. If I can put it that way, I'm kind of oversimplifying. But that's a very different texture than let me learn the tricks and the wizardry that will enable me to manipulate spiritual forces, So that's where I would balk, because I often do at these films, that it's not the authentic biblical stuff we're getting introduced to, but a Gnostic world.
It seems like a lot of these films almost go all the way when they paint these scenes of the main figures trying to manipulate or control the Force in Star Wars or this energy in Doctor Strange, and then eventually realizing the only way to be successful is to cooperate with it, to in some way let it work on you instead of the other way around. They never fully make that point, but I'm thinking in Doctor Strange, the example of that cloak that goes around him, that it sort of wraps itself around him, and in its own way, it's its own thing. It controls itself, and that he sort of just puts it on and cooperates with it rather than using it in a domineering way. It's like grace, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose. And there are echoes. Like, for example, Doctor Strange does a kind of Christ-like move, where he enters into struggle with the evil power. In a self-sacrificial act, he's able to kind of unleash others. He frees others through his own self-sacrifice. And someone maybe Father Steve told me that the director is, in fact, an evangelical Christian. And so there were, I would say, explicitly Christian motifs in it, but acted out within a fundamentally Gnostic framework. The very fact that we refer to these powers or the power as it sort of gives away the game, the Force, may the Force be with you. Well, the Force is not a person. See, the different texture between may the Force be with you and may the Lord be with you, there's a world of difference there spiritually. But, I would say 2 cheers for Doctor Strange, because I think it does accomplish some good things, perhaps especially for young people who are in the grip of this deadening scientism. I don't know, by the way, if you saw this. Maybe you sent it to me. This group of scientists who really came out against Richard Dawkins. Do you see that? I was very encouraged by it, who basically were saying, look, this is way beyond our competence, and scientists should not be playing this game of, religion is obviously nonsense and we can disprove it. They were saying, show a little humility about the limits of your own epistemology. So I was kind of gladdened to see that, because over and over again you hear the scientific community, it's all, atheist and so on. So I think that's a good challenge that the young people might get from Doctor Strange.
Let's move on here. You also recently saw a film where the Christianity is perhaps a bit more explicit, but is nevertheless just as good a film as Doctor Strange, and it was Mel Gibson's latest film called Hacksaw Ridge. Now, I haven't seen this one, but tell us a little bit about it. What's the main plot, and then we'll get into some of the details.
Well, it's a true story about this guy named Desmond Doss, who was a young man from Virginia, and a devout Christian, and a believer in nonviolence. But he wants to participate in the war. He feels that, this terrible war is going on and he should play his part. So he said, I'll join, but I want to be a medic, basically. And so he does join, but predictably, all kinds of problems ensue, when his commanders and his fellow soldiers don't really get this. You mean, what, you're not going to hold a rifle? You're not going to fire? And so he goes through a real trial during his basic training, and at one point, he's almost court-martialed because they think he's just being resistant, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, it comes to its climax when this group ends up at Okinawa. in one of the worst battles in the Pacific Theater. And they have to climb this high ridge, this Hacksaw Ridge, and then make their way across in the face of enormous resistance. Well, the movie then is about how this young kid, 21 years old, who won't carry a rifle, but ends up saving upwards of 100 of his fellows by risking his life at every turn to get the wounded off the battlefield and then down the ridge. And that's part of the drama of the movie. But there's a lovely moment, and it's an exact reproduction of what Desmond Doss, in fact, himself wrote. That after rescuing a guy, he would lie on the ground exhausted. He'd say, "Lord, let me get one more." And then he'd go and he'd get one more. Then he'd say, "Lord, let me get one more." And then off he'd go until, as I say, it's disputed, but they say upwards of 100 men he managed to basically drag off the battlefield under the most deadly conditions imaginable. So anyway, that's the movie. It's the story of this kid's tremendous courage and his religious conviction.
It reminds me of Abraham's bargaining with God, but for 50 men, but what about for 5 or even one righteous man? Please,
there's a lovely moment, too, when he, in the midst of all of this horrific, nightmarish battle, he says, and he prays aloud, "Lord, what do you want? What do you want?" And then he hears this voice from across the battlefield shouting, "Medic, medic." And so off he goes. And so there it is for biblically minded people. That's what God wants. God wanted him to do this heroic act of love.
Now, you've said that this film sheds a lot of light on the question of the proper response to evil, whether we pursue violent means or nonviolent means. Help us to parse through this question.
Yeah, I just saw the movie last night, so I'm still thinking it through. And the fact that Mel Gibson made it is interesting. So he's a good filmmaker, and he's made a lot of good war movies, from Braveheart to When We Were Soldiers and now this one. So he's a guy that knows about the violence of warfare, or The Patriot. Think of so many of his movies. But yet he's fascinated by this character who enters, yes, into this horrific battle, but without a weapon and fighting, if you want, nonviolently. So I thought that was interesting that of all people, Mel Gibson makes the movie. And, a movie I thought of a lot as I was watching it was one of my favorite movies, The Mission, which is about these Jesuit establishments in South America that are being threatened. And then one of the Jesuit priests says, no, we should organize the people in a violent resistance. And his leader says, no, we should organize them nonviolently. And the movie ends with the thing destroyed, neither one successful. And it shows you both paths, And I thought of that a lot during this movie here's a great evil that's being resisted. Many resisting it with machine guns and grenades and flamethrowers. I mean, these terrible, terrible weapons of violence. And then this kid resisting it through love and caring for people and dragging them off the battlefield. In one scene, he's dragging this guy off the battlefield as the wounded man, is firing his machine gun at the Japanese. So there they both are doing their thing, And that's what I thought of was the church has a just war theory. Sometimes in this fallen, conflictual world, there are certain evils that can only be resisted through violence. Okay. And we have very strict criteria to govern that, but yet there's an openness to it. We also do, go back to Jesus himself, through Origen up to people like Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, there is a tradition of nonviolent resistance. Is there room for both? And I have argued for years, following my mentor, Cardinal George, that yes, there is room, I think, for both. And we shouldn't allow one simply to extricate the other. Do you know what I mean? There's something to the witness of nonviolence that's extremely powerful. And yet, in the fallen, conflictual world, was that the only way we can resist? Maybe not. And the fact that both are on display, there's something I think valuable about that. So that's kind of an initial thought I have, just having seen this movie.
Now, you told me there's a very moving scene at the end where the main character is being dragged off the battlefield asking for his Bible. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's lovely. So after this terrible night where he delivers the 100 people, up they go again. They have to fight again. And now people are throwing grenades. They were feigning surrender, the Japanese, and so the Americans are approaching, at which point they all start throwing grenades at them. And so Desmond, the main character, basically kicks away a grenade, but in the process, his own leg is very badly wounded. So they're carrying him off, and it's like, there's nothing more you can possibly do, and they're carrying him off the field. And through his tears, and his mouth is kind of distorted. He can't speak clearly, but he's saying, "My Bible, my Bible, my Bible." And he had a little Bible that his fiancée, who eventually became his wife, gave him before he went off to battle. And so they dutifully went back and found it for him. But what the scene conveys, I think, beautifully is he's a man of the Bible. He's a man of the Word of God, and he took that seriously and based his commitment on it. So lovely. Amidst all the horror of that scene, there's the Word of God that he was himself embodying.
Well, it's time now from one of our questions from our listeners. If you have a question, we'd love to hear it, whether it's about movies, God, Jesus, the Bible, the church, anything. Just visit askbishopbarron.com and you can record your question there on any device. Today we have a question that we get all the time at Word on Fire. Anytime we release a commentary on movies or TV shows or anything, people often wonder where we draw the line when it comes to graphic content, whether it be violence or nudity. So today we have a question on those grounds from Devin. So here's Devin's question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Devin. I'm from Thousand Oaks, California. And my question to you is, at what point do you decide not to watch a movie or read a book or to stop watching a TV show based on its content? I know there's a lot of good content out there, but that often good content is peppered with, more graphic or disturbing content. So I just want to know, at what point do you draw the line, and what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, good, Devin. First of all, thank you. You're calling from my pastoral region here in Thousand Oaks, California. Good question. And as Brandon said, we get that a lot. Let me just say a couple things about it. There's a book I know that includes rape and murder and incest and adultery and masturbation and imperialistic oppression and almost every type of human dysfunction. And it's called the Bible. So as I've said before, if you were filming the Bible, like every scene in it, it would be at least an R rating. The Bible is not just a nice, sweet Sound of Music sort of book. The Bible is full of the full panoply of human dysfunction. So we can't afford, it seems to me, to be so puritanical in our taste that we won't deal with that. Because God deals with it. There's in some ways the major theme of the Bible is that God enters into all of that and addresses it from within. Most great art, so go across the disciplines, you're in the plastic arts, you're the literary arts, the dramatic arts, opera, etc. Almost all the great arts involve some wrestling with deep forms of human dysfunction. It's what drives much drama, right? If we close ourselves completely to that, we're closing ourselves to most of the high literary and dramatic art that's been produced. That's why, you say children's stories. Now, children's stories, too, can have a pretty dark side to them. But if we limit ourselves to that, then we're not getting into the real meat of it. Here's another observation. Should we limit our own viewing and the viewing of people for whom we're responsible in many cases? Yes, obviously. I think parents should limit what their kids see. I'm often scandalized by the music that young kids listen to, the graphic violence. The sexuality is one thing, but the graphic violence in these video games, I was shocked when I discovered some of that little people like 10, 11-year-olds are watching. One more step. Should we limit ourselves? Yeah. If you're pretty convinced that types of viewing are going to lead you to bad thoughts, bad actions, yeah, don't watch them. You should be wary of that. But that's a judgment call, isn't it? It's a prudential call. What are you able to watch? I mean, obviously, things that are pornographic, things that are just utterly gratuitous in their violence and all that. Sure, I agree that everyone should censor themselves, But I think there's a plenty of room for responsible, thoughtful, engaged, mature people to enter into these works of art, and in some ways take the good with the bad, see what's good and true and beautiful in the midst sometimes of a lot of ambiguity. So those are a couple perspectives, I would say, Devin. It's a hard question to answer in a simple way, but that might set the context for it anyway.
Well, thanks for listening to this episode of the Word on Fire show. We have plenty of other film commentaries from Bishop Barron at our website, wordonfire.org. Just go to that website and then under the resources menu, choose online videos, and there you'll find all of his film commentaries. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.